The Rust Bucket Saga continues. Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Painting and Weathering. This show is going to be a little more experimental than some of the other ones I've been doing in that I'm going to try stuff and it may not always work out, the way I hope it will. So far, so good, I think. The first episode worked out pretty much as I was expecting, and I think this one will too. But, that may not always be the case. So we'll just kind of have to see how things go. And if stuff doesn't work, I'll show you that, and we'll try to fix it. Anyway, the first episode was about touching up and fading the paint on a boxcar model that I'm building. This second episode is going to be about different techniques for rust. And the way I think about it, and this is not official by any means, but there's 3 different kinds of rust that I kind of have categorized in my own head. One is a very light kind of tint that kind of can apply to a whole model. Then there are little darker rust patches that tend to be very hard-edged and discrete. And then there's kind of rust streaking and haloing effects, which sometimes come from those patches and either run down the side of the car or make a little discolored area around the darker patch. So I'm going to try all those different things on this car, and we'll see how it goes. Apologies in advance for getting my hand in the shot in a few places. I try not to do that, but this being a more experimental show, I think it just happened a few times, and I will work on that for the future. Also, there's a little bit of an audio glitch in a couple places where I think my lapel mic was rubbing on my clothes, and it makes a little kind of a static noise in the background. So if you hear that, that's what it is. Unfortunately, that wasn't something I could easily get rid of, but hopefully it's not too annoying, and I will work on that as well because I don't like audio glitches. But anyway, without further ado, let's get to it. So in the photos of this car and other cars too that I've seen, there's basically 3 different kinds of rust that I want to reproduce. One is kind of a very thin surface rust kind of haze over the entire car. Then there are spots of rust, and then also there are streaks. So it's 3 different things, and I'm going to use 3 different methods to reproduce them. So for this first thing, I want to do the overall haze. So I'm going to use some Vallejo paint. This is orange rust, and this is dark earth. I don't really like too much orange. I really think this is a really bright, very strong color, and it's really easy to overdo it. So I'm going to mix these 2 together and mostly use the dark earth with just a little bit of orange in it. And then I'm going to apply it as a wash. So this is some of the dark earth. And then just going to add like a drop of orange. These have already started to mix together on their own, but I'm just going to swirl it around a little bit. Okay, maybe I could use a little more orange than that. That's still pretty brown. Yeah, there we go. That's pretty good. It's just brown with just a hint of orange in it. I'm going to use 2 different brushes. The larger brush is for applying some water with a little bit of detergent in it as a wetting agent. And then the smaller brush is for applying the paint. So I actually had to add a little more Windex is what I'm using with the water because it was pooling up too much. Water's got a lot of surface tension. One of the things I don't like is full-scale, full-size water droplet marks that can happen if with washes. That's why I'm always a little cautious with washes. So just gonna flow a little of this paint mixture in with the smaller brush. In the photos, it's more concentrated toward the bottom, so that's what I'm trying to do. You can go back over it with the big brush, kind of pull it down. A lot of this is probably going to lighten up when it dries. That's okay though. I always like subtle. I'm of the opinion that you can always add more, but it's really hard to take off weathering once it's been applied. Let's see, on this side this is pooling up too much, so I'm just going to squirt it directly with some Windex. One of the nice things about working with water-based paints is it's much less stinky and toxic. Boxcars tend to accumulate a lot of rust around the side of the door where the track is, so it can be a little heavier handed with it there. Also, you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm wiping the big brush off on a paper towel after I pull it across the car so that I don't accumulate too much moisture on it. Kind of using it to wick off some of the excess and some of these bubbles. I don't want, outlines of bubbles. That wouldn't be the effect I was after either. So I don't want to use like isopropyl alcohol because sometimes that reacts with the paint, depending on what kind of paint you use. And it can produce effects. Sometimes the effects are good and sometimes they're not. Kind of depends on, what you're after. But tend to like to apply stuff in a more controlled way. The idea here isn't to change the color of the car, it's just to give it a slight rusty tint. I really think there's a tendency to want to overdo rust on models. I've been there myself. And, it's not always a great look when something comes out too orange. Anyway, I prefer the rust to be more subtle at this point because this is just kind of a tint on the car. This is where, looking at photos really is helpful because a lot of times things, even a car that's really beat out, isn't really as rusty as I think sometimes we have a tendency to want to make it. So I put the car on a roll of tape so I can have it upright for the ends. Let gravity help a little bit. So as you might expect, photos show that the rust accumulates more on the tops, like of these ridges, than on the underside. When it's mostly dry, you can kind of go back over it with just a little hint of paint if you want to add more in places. And you can use the big brush to kind of blend it. So I don't want to forget about the roof. You can use the same techniques here. I'm going to wet it first. And dab in a little paint. A lot of boxcars tend to get rusty between the ribs, kind of like in this area, and then there's a clearer spot. Sometimes it's different, but there is a lot of patterning to the way that rust forms on the roof of boxcars like this. Again, it's good to consult photos. kind of jabbing at it with the brush here to create a little bit of a spotty effect, at least in the rib area. Always add more paint in spots. And if it's wet, it kind of feathers out into a nice soft pattern. I don't want to tilt this too much and have everything run to one side, but you can see it's a little bit blotchy, and that's what I'm after. Okay, now it's had a chance to dry, and I think it's looking pretty good. It's just a little bit of a hint of rust along the sides, and because I turned the car upright, it's a little more concentrated down at the bottom. And that's pretty much what the photos look like. So I'm going to leave it here with this step for now, and we'll move on to the next thing. So this was kind of an accident, but I stumbled across this bottle of Vallejo Light Blue, and I started playing around, and I kind of like the effects. So I'm going to do a little bit of that before we continue with the rest. So what I'm doing is just kind of dry brushing very little bit of this light blue and then rubbing my finger over it. And it just puts a slight highlight on the ribs. I tried rubbing it with a brush, but actually my finger works better. Just to rub it like that and rub most of it off. But it just leaves a little bit of a highlight. It's almost like the less paint that's on the brush, the better. This is another one of those cases where the color needs to be somewhere in the ballpark with the color of the model. This wouldn't look good maybe on a red car. So again, this is super subtle, but it just puts a little highlight on those ribs. You can highlight the details on the door with this too. Again, there's almost no paint on this brush. It's very dry. So now I want to get onto the rust spots, and for this I'm going to use two different things. I've got a dark brown colored pencil. You could also use burnt umber or burnt sienna, and this is burnt umber Vallejo paint. So I'm going to start with the paint and then do smaller details with the pencil. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit nerve-wracking because this is hard to undo. I'm just going to use a little tiny brush and a little bit of paint and just put some rust spots along the bottom down here. Again, I'm looking at photos to try to, get the placement. And I'm kind of dabbing because these tend to be kind of hard edged, I guess. They're very jagged. So I want to get more of like paint flaking almost kind of effect, and as opposed to having it be blended all over the place like this other rust is very subtle and blended. This is supposed to be very discreet. I've turned the model upside down to hopefully make it a little easier to see what I'm doing. Trying not to get my hand in the way. There tends to be more rust on boxcars too. I've noticed behind where the door slides. That area seems to get beat up a little bit. So be a little heavier with it in here. Anyway, this Should just be kind of blotchy and random looking. Try not to think too much about it. Just don't want to overdo it. Again, overdoing it is hard to undo. So better to do less than too much. I want to forget the door. Just do a little bit of random blotchiness. Again, this is almost dry brushing here. I'm not using a lot of paint. Less paint makes it look more scuffed, which is, on a door, I think is kind of effective because, they get beat on a lot. I'm not going to do too much up in this area where the lettering is because I'm going to overpaint that later. So no point in putting a bunch of stuff up there. And I'm going to put a few random spots of rust just around the car body. Just here and there. Again, trying not to overdo it. One thing I see a lot on boxcars too is like horizontal rust streaks behind where the door slides. It's one of those things, I think the more random it is, the better. Oh, I don't want to put too much here around the reporting marks either because I'm going to patch over those too, so no point in doing too much work in that area. I did put a dot there and I'm probably going to paint over, but that's okay. It'll all work out. Okay, I could keep going, but I think I'm going to quit there on this side. Now I got to do the other side. I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera. All right, and there's the other side so far. Kind of similar to the first side. Not exactly. They shouldn't be carbon copies of each other because, they wouldn't be the same in real life. Just wanted to mention, this thing's starting to look like kind of a rust bucket, but if you really look at it, the rust is very localized to certain spots. Vast portions of the car are still blue. They're not orange. So making something look like a rust bucket is not about turning everything rust color. It's about, making it look like real things that rust look. So now that I've done the paint, I can come back with the pencil and use this to apply some streaking as well. Pencils work really well for really tiny little lines, and I like them because it's a little easier to control, at least for me, than a paintbrush. And because this is a very similar brown to the paint, it blends really well. And it kind of illustrates another point, and that is there's always more than one way to do something. And using different media can sometimes help, like maybe you're more comfortable using a pencil than you are using a paintbrush. So, if that's true, then you can do that, or you can just use the paint. Some people just like paint, it just kind of, it's whatever works, It's kind of what I'm getting at. I like the pencil because I can make these tiny little marks, and it just makes it look like it's got all these little tiny rust spots. You can also take a pencil on a car like this and kind of trace down the sides of the ribs, and it makes a little kind of a shadow effect. It's very effective, very subtle, but I like it. If you want to do this too, I find it easier to do all the ribs on one side. And then flip the car around and do the other side, rather than trying to contort your hand into weird positions. So that's after shading all of the ribs. Again, it's really subtle. Most everything I do is little subtle effects, but you put them all together and it works. Before I move on, I'm going to take my dry brush and just get off any excess pencil wax that might be on there. These colored pencils are really more like crayons than they are like pencils, so they do leave a bit of a residue sometimes. I'm going back to paint now. I'm going to do some streaking under the door track here, because I've noticed that in the photos there's some streaking in this area. Put on some paint, and then let's see, we can just drag it down with the big brush. It's too dry. Let's try it again. Yeah, there we go. So the thing I found with streaking is the best effects are when you don't mess with it too much. Sometimes there's a little streaking up here at the top too. Using a little bit more water to make this a little more subtle. I don't want to forget about the roof. So I'm using that same dark brown paint, burnt umber, and I'm just kind of stabbing at it with the brush. A little bit bigger brush. I'm trying to hit the same panels that I hit with the wash earlier, so that it's concentrated in roughly the same areas. So this is all just that same dark umber. The darker spots are just where the paint's a little more concentrated. The more you do this, the lighter it gets because there's less paint on the brush. So if you want a darker effect, just add more paint. Okay, now here's where the orange can finally come into play a little bit. These are some Bragdon self-adhesive weathering powders. This is the rusty orange, and this is a dark brown. So I have just a little bit of that rusty orange on a micro brush, and you can use it to kind of give a little bit of a halo effect to some of these rust spots, and then you can also pull it down to streak it. Really like this effect, layering, weathering. You can also use it in this area to kind of give a little bit more of a layered look in certain spots. Again though, I try to go easy on this orange because it's really powerful as a color, and it's real easy to get too much on there. So to me, this is like the effect you get from a rusty spot that's slowly leaching rust onto the rest of the paint as rain comes down. You can also use a brush to blend it, which is especially good if it seems a little too heavy-handed. This will take a little bit of it off, make it more subtle. There's also the dark brown color, which can be used to kind of blend in with the burnt umber that I used earlier. Again, it just kind of gives it a little bit of a fade, like the patchy rust is creeping into the rest of the surrounding area, but hasn't quite taken a hold yet. You can streak with the powders as well, like down here. I like the powders because they're very subtle. They tend to produce really kind of soft edged effects. which is good sometimes. It's good for these streaks under the door as well, or under the door track, I mean. Those shading effects I was doing with the pencil can also be done with powders. You want the same thing, you just run it along the edges of the ribs. I also like this dark brown for messing up the door a little more. Alright, so I think that's looking pretty good now. I could keep going, but again, I think sometimes it's better to quit while you're ahead. I like the way the door came out a little bit splotchy, so that there's some, blue paint showing, and then there's, darker spots, and it looks like a door that's been well used. I'm going to use some powder on the roof as well. Just dab it on. This time I'm using a brush, and I'm sure a lot of you have an old paintbrush that's kind of stiff and not really good for much, but it's good for this. I'm starting with the orange color again. One thing nice about these powders is if it looks like there's too much on there, you can shake it off or blow it off, and some of it will flake off. It only really sticks when you scrub it, so you do have a little bit of room to correct it. I'll go for the dark brown. Tones it down a little bit. Yeah, that's not looking too bad. So I'm pretty happy with how this model's turning out so far. I've got the paint faded and now it looks pretty rusty. The next step in the next episode will be to apply some patching. And the reason I waited for that is because that goes over what's already there. Just like on the real car that I'm looking at, it looks like that part was done later. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and I think it'll be pretty cool and hopefully worth all the effort in the end. So if you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.